Hello and welcome in to this week's edition of The Walk. I'm your host, Intern Joe Macheca. With me is my colleague at Gamecock Central, the man, the myth, the legend, Mike Uva. Mike, how are we doing this fine evening?
I'm doing well, Joe. Just continuing to stay busy with the portal and everything else right now that's going on with Gamecock football and Gamecock athletics.
Yeah, absolutely. Busy, as busy of a time as ever with the transfer portal stuff. We'll break down all of that because there's been plenty of action. But Mike, I guess starting with that at the top, South Carolina adds Alabama transfer defensive lineman. What are you seeing from him? And then also, like, what are you seeing or what are you hearing in terms of transfer portal for South Carolina football?
So I think the two things that I want to bring right off the top before I specifically talk about them is the fact that last night we reported this Gamecock Central. Last night you had two Power 5 prospects here. I know we're going to get into both of them. I share that because I know with what's been going on with this transfer portal cycle, it's easy to get discouraged sometimes not being able to get, okay, I want this guy, I want that guy. And we've talked about this before. Even if it's not a Power 5 guy, even if it's not a guy from the SEC, being able to bring some players in from an FCS school, a Group 5 school, guys that have experience, right? Guys that have experience that have proven it at the lower level. You can bring them in, and South Carolina has proven in a short period of time. It's a sample size, but they've proven for the majority of it, they've been able to have success with it. So I share that because don't get discouraged when you continue to see some of this, right? Does that mean South Carolina is trying to – the bottom line is they're trying to win games, right? They're trying to win games. Having said all that, though, being able to go out into the portal and to be able to bring in two players from Power 5 schools, number one from Alabama and one from Oklahoma. And this is the other thing, too. Pimp on a Blimp mentions he's only played 5 games in 2 seasons. This is what my whole point is, that when you bring players in from Power 5 schools, we can look at this two different ways, right? We can look at it as, man, this guy doesn't have a lot of experience playing at that level, which is another reason why South Carolina and other schools, for that matter, have continued to go out and bring in guys from schools who have experience. Having said that, that doesn't mean these two players are lost causes by any means, right? I mean, you look at Oklahoma, you look at Alabama especially, those are two schools that produce a lot of talent, right? You're only going to be able to play so many guys. So I say that because when we look at the first one, Joe, look at the first play that you mentioned, defensive lineman from Alabama.
Monkel Goodwine, yep.
Monkel Goodwine. Having a chance to see him last night, because as we reported, we ran into the two prospects. The coaching staff was there. And I say the coaching staff, I mean, there's probably about 6 or 7 of them there. He is a big boy. But having said that, too, like both these players that we're going to talk about, they have ties to the Maryland area. So I bring that up because Shane's, not just Shane, but this coaching staff as a whole, continuing to go into the DMV area, continuing to build those pipelines up. Certainly, if you're able to get production from these two players, that's massive. But having said that, and this is someone that was a 5-star at one point coming out of high school, we're talking about with Goodwine, being able to continue that pipeline in Maryland, in the DMV area, that's an area that Shane wants to continue to have success in. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind. So bottom line is this. He's a player who he saw 2 games this past season for the Crimson Tide, rotated in against Middle Tennessee and Mississippi State, played in 1 contest in 2022 and 2 during his freshman season in Tuscaloosa in 2021. Alabama. I mean, that's a school that produces studs left and right. So here's a guy that coming out was a 5-star at one point, depending on what website you read, and you're going to go into a factory, right? I mean, there's other guys that are going to come in. So I bring that up because simply put, these are guys, especially when we're talking about Goodwine, we'll go down the list here. This is a guy that I feel like can make an impact here. And let's say he comes in here and God forbid he's not a guy that starts, right? He's definitely someone that's going to be able to add depth. And as we know with South Carolina's offensive line from a year ago, man, they will certainly welcome depth. So again, that's not to say this guy's going to be a backup, but my whole point is that's the worst case scenario. Best case scenario, you bring a guy in here that's going to be able to compete for a starting job, which is what they expect him to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of the bigger things that Boogie Huntley and Tonka Hemingway asked for this offseason was help. And I think Goodwine can certainly come in and compete and certainly find his, into the rotation in the defensive line. In the SEC, you need to rotate a lot. Especially, Tennessee has a very high powered and fast offense. So does Ole Miss. And so, you have to have depth at the defensive line, and Goodwine, certainly helps with that. And then Mike, the other offensive lineman from Oklahoma, I know you touched on him a little bit, but what are you seeing from him more in particularly?
Well, again, another big boy, having a chance to be able to see him as well as a Goodwine last night. Another big guy out there. He is a member of the 2020 recruiting class. Then Sooners assistant coach Shane Beamer had a role in recruiting him at the prep level. So bringing these things up, right? We talk about pipelines from a high school standpoint, trying to be able to get players out of the state of Maryland and still, talking about the transfer portal as well. Shane also is going back to the well, going back and going to, some of the relationships that he built with some of these men that ended up going to Oklahoma when he was still over coaching with the Sooners. So I think with this young man, more than anything, again, a guy that comes from the DMV area, a guy that played growing up from the state of Maryland. This past season played in 3 games. He was a backup on the offensive line. I'm mixed. I'm sorry, Joe. This is what happens when you confuse everything. When you have the Alabama player's a defensive lineman. Excuse me. This is what happens when you have 2 players commit in the trenches. South Carolina, they're going heavy in the trenches. Aaron Parks is an offensive lineman. So everything that I was talking about with Goodwine, I meant about Parks as far as depth. And then, of course, Goodwine being able to compete for a spot on the defensive line. But with Parks, the thing about him is, yes, similar to Goodwine, doesn't have the same amount of experience in comparison to some of the players South Carolina has brought in years past, when you're talking about maybe some of the smaller level schools or even some of the schools from, Power 5 schools like South Carolina has brought in over the last couple of years at different spots. But he's a guy, number one, again, played at a very good school. And when you're competing against that type of talent in practice every day, that's something that should not be overlooked. Because even though you're not playing in these games, again, last season, only saw action against Arkansas State, Tulsa, and West Virginia. Played in 3 games as a backup last year on the O-line. The fact that he's going up against the competition that he's going up against every day in practice, and you can say the same about Goodwine with Alabama, that is something that you can't replicate. You can't once you get to this level. So, yes, the experience might not be there necessarily, but at the same time, too, let's not forget, here's a young man that was recruited by a different coaching staff as well. So I think more with anything, when we talk about Parks, he's a guy that was brought in there by a different coaching staff. And sometimes when you have a new coaching staff that comes in, you're not necessarily their guy. They're not going to bend over backwards always to make sure that they get you in there. So I bring that up because I think that's another important thing when we look at this player in particular as to maybe why he wasn't getting as much playing time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Aaron Parks will be able to come in. He's a Maryland guy. Like Mike said earlier, I think, he'll mesh well with
all these Maryland guys at once, Joe. They're freaking confusing me. You're throwing 2 guys in the trenches and 2 Maryland guys at us in the same day.
2 bigger ones, or the most recent welcome homes, if you will, that have been, confirmed and reported. And we can sit here and talk, all night about specific players, and we will in a second. But there are some comments. Todd asks, what is our current scholarship count? Mike, do you have it off the top of your head?
I'm going to pull it up right now because we continue to update that at Gamecock Central.
That's the thing.
Yeah, and the tough thing about that is we're going to be heading into a week where South Carolina is going to be having to make some tough decisions, on some of this if they are at that mark. And when you look at what South Carolina has from a scholarship standpoint, the last I checked, if they're not at it, if they're not over it, they're very, very close to it now. They're very, very close to it now. So I want to make sure I can pull this up because we might be able to share it, Joe.
Yeah.
Let's see here. And as you already know, there's a bunch of other things we can talk about the running back coach situation because that's something else that we're monitoring. And that plays a role as to why. Okay, so yes, South Carolina is currently at 86. 86 players now. So they're 1 over right now, the limit, according to our records over on Gamecock Central. And if people want to see that, I'm going to share the link in the comments section. You guys can see the rundown on the scholarship players. That's the link. That's a great link to add to your favorites if you just want to constantly just monitor that. So that's just something to continue to pay attention to, because we're at an era now, Joe. We talked about this before on our show that we do together. Because of COVID and everything, numbers have really fluctuated over the last couple of years. And we're slowly starting to get back to somewhat of a normality. And I'm not even just talking about scholarships. I'm talking about just numbers in general. So that's why I'm bringing that up, is because we're starting to slowly get back into what was normal. And again, things tweak over time. It's not the exact thing, that it was a couple of years ago. But my point being is we're starting to get back to some normalcy.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love it. And the transfer portal is certainly evolving as well. Big Red Ass isn't having too many good players on a roster, a signal of growth. I mean, this is kind of a theoretical question, but I guess for me at least, a signal of growth. It doesn't really matter who you bring in. It's what matters what happens between the lines on Saturdays. You can bring in a bunch of guys and sure, for a culture standpoint, yeah, it's a good, something good to point to. But I mean, if you're bringing in, 5-star guys and they're not producing, we saw that kind of at Texas A&M a little bit with Jimbo Fisher. He had all these 5-stars and they didn't do anything. Same thing goes for the portal. Obviously with the portal, guys have a little bit more experience, but I think again, at the end of the day, success on the field is what it boils down to. But yeah, in terms of short-term goals, like adding guys that have potential, is big, and then guys that can play right is also big in terms of off-season goals.
Nope, I agree, and I apologize. And Joe knows this already. I'm looking down because there's a couple other things that we're monitoring this evening, and that's not to say there'll be a welcome home this evening. I don't want to dangle the meat. People talk about the carrot. I don't want to dangle the meat, the steak in front of you guys. That's what's going on. But there could be some other things happening over the next day or so. So we're continuing to monitor things at Gamecock Central that we've been paying attention to the last couple of days. But look, I mean, those are two players again. Being able to bring them in, and like I said, sometimes you bring a player in here and it just didn't work out at a different school, right? For one reason or another. And we've seen that. We've seen that with players that have left South Carolina. We've seen that with players that have come to South Carolina. You can look across the country too. But I bring that up simply because I really like what they were able to do, number one, with going into the DMV area. But number two, the fact that you have these two players who arrived here yesterday and their visit trickled over into today, which is mostly that's how a lot of these transfer visits are going. The other visits, a normal visit typically is like 2 days, right? In a span of like 48 hours, just under that. These visits are less than 24 hours, around that 24-hour mark. So they came in yesterday, went out to dinner last night, as we reported on Gamecock Central, and USC was able to close. So I bring that up, Joe, because that should not be overlooked. That should not be overlooked, that they were able to close. Now, naturally, in the era that we live in, people are going to be like, well, it had to be from an NIL standpoint. I don't know the logistics of it for both deals, if there were any deals, but I will say this, that was not a concern. From the people that I spoke with going back to last night, that wasn't an issue. That NIL was not something that was going to drag this out. These guys want to be here. Both players want to be here. And this coaching staff, the recruiting staff, Jessica Jackson, the coaches, Sam Chabet, I mean, go down the list. They did an outstanding job of making sure that both these players, and we can go back to the earlier in the week with the other players as well, but these two in particular over the last, 24, 36 hours, they made sure that these two did not leave without making sure that they committed to South Carolina.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I would agree. And then, I mean, there's plenty more players to get to in terms of guys where we left off, because we left this show off before the holiday break. The show obviously coming out on Sundays, being Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve. So a little bit of a break for this show. So we'll get to the rest of those players. But Mike, obviously there's rumors and rumblings about the running back coach. There were a couple questions the Green Ass doesn't make sense to bring in the Arkansas running back coach. I guess, what are you hearing? I know there's some stuff we are hearing that we can't necessarily talk about, but what can you tell the people about the running back coach situation?
Well, first, want to welcome Oscar Attaway Jr. And for those of you that are in the chat, I haven't had a chance to meet you, sir, but looking forward to meeting you. Gamecock fans, be sure to welcome him. Looking forward to being able to see your son play out here in the near future. But having said that, we put this out on Gamecock Central last night. A name that I was told to keep a very close eye on last night. And we put this up on the Insiders Forum. So for those of you that aren't subscribers to Gamecock Central, take advantage. You can sign up for the first month for $1. Can't beat that deal. But one name that I was told to keep an eye on, because I know Jimmy Smith's name is going to get floated around, okay? But another name I was told to keep an eye on is Newland Isaac. He is the running backs coach at Liberty, also was the co-offensive coordinator, did outstanding things at Liberty this past year. But on top of that, he has ties to South Carolina, Hopkins, South Carolina native. When you look at his resume and what he's been able to accomplish, I mean, they had 2 1,000-yard running backs or rushers last year, really one because the other one was a quarterback. But to give you an idea of how dominant Liberty's rushing attack was last year, they rushed for over 4,000 yards. That was 1,000 yards better than the number 2 team in the conference. In addition to that, like I said, they produced 2 1,000-yard rushers. Their leading rusher, who led the conference, over 1,400 yards. Their quarterback finished with over 1,000, which was the second best. And I bring that up simply because he's the co-offensive coordinator. So want to be able to mention that. Named the 2021 AFCA FBS Assistant Coach of the Year by the American Football Coaches Association. You know, he was promoted to co-offensive coordinator at Coastal Carolina, working with Jamie Chadwell, who obviously he followed to Liberty in February of 2019. He's a former walk-on wide receiver at Charleston Southern, who eventually worked his way up through the ranks. And when I look at his coaching resume and some of the schools that he went through, coaching at a couple of Division II schools, Delta State, which I'm familiar with from my Mississippi days, a D2 powerhouse. I bring that up is because this is someone, when I think about from a recruiting standpoint, someone that played at the Division II level, someone that has a lot of connections with Division II coaches, FCS coaches, Group 5 coaches, all the way up to FBS. A lot of these guys that come up from these smaller schools, they have to develop habits when it comes to recruiting, working with less resources. So if this is a guy that is a good recruiter, never mind the fact from a development standpoint, which he's proven wherever he's gone, and again, being named the Assistant Coach of the Year back in 2021, that's pretty damn good. If he is just even a decent recruiter, imagine what he's going to be able to do with the resources here. So I say that because, again, I feel like regardless of who you look at from a resume standpoint, when you look at coaches, whether it be a running back coach, whether it'll be a receivers coach, whatever the case may be, I don't think everyone's going to be happy, right? You're not going to make everyone happy, right? You look at Montario Hardesty, who I have nothing but respect for. I have nothing but respect for Montario Hardesty. But I say that because there's a portion of this fan base, and I understand, that wasn't too pleased with him. What I would say is, well, when Montario was here, if you feel like Isaac's resume, and again, I don't think this is the case. I think his resume is incredible. But if you think it's an underwhelming resume, one can argue, well, Hardesty's resume was probably, on the opposite side of that. It was, overwhelming. But what did that lead to? So I bring that up simply because don't write someone off just because they're not coming from, I'm making this up, Arkansas, an SEC school, whatever the case may be. This dude has proven that he's really dang talented. And again, this is a name that I would keep an eye on.
Yeah, absolutely. And, be excited about him. Again, the co-offensive coordinator part is what excites me. He knows football. When you have a running backs coach that knows kind of the play calling side of things and what to look for, not just only in the running back room. He kind of knows, wide receivers, quarterbacks, offensive line.
Shows the trust, every Joe, position.
And
Joe, it shows the trust.
Absolutely. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. And, it also helps from a player standpoint too. that he's that plugged in and, is going to be, I don't necessarily know what his whole role is going to be here, but I'm assuming he'll help Dowell out with the play calling and stuff like that. And that helps with trust in the running back room, recruiting wise, and then also with other positions too. When other positions trust, the running back room coach, for this, example, it helps, them trust, I guess, the players that are coming out of that room. You know what I'm saying, Mike?
Joe, real quick, because Chris,
Yeah.
this is what I mean by this. When we talk about overwhelming, obviously we could set our levels of what overwhelming is, but I'm talking about when you look at what Monterio did. Monterio played in the NFL. Monterio played in the SEC. He was at Tennessee for a year, right? Quality control coach. Yes, he was at Charles, but my point is he had a lot of experience with the SEC. And that was one thing in particular when he arrived at South Carolina that a lot of people brought up. And they were like, man, this guy has a lot of experience. Man, he played in the NFL. Again, I have nothing but respect for Monterio Hardesty. But my point being is if you look at blind resumes, take the fact of the awards out and all that kind of stuff, and you just look at the schools, some people would look at Monterio's and they'd say, oh, Isaac, you can't even compare that. That's what I'm trying to get at. If you strictly look at the schools, that's all I'm getting at.
Yeah, no.
I understand, Chris, I get you, but I'm just going back to what I remember during the hiring process and some of the things fans said when he was brought in. That's what I'm trying to get at. I'm not saying that you said that, but that's some of the things that I recall from the message boards and some of the things we saw were just hearing around town.
Yeah, sometimes, I'm not saying this was the case necessarily with Mo Hardesty as well, but sometimes you get some of those veteran players in there, and it doesn't all correlate, from that. Mike, transitioning in a little bit again, we're getting a lot of questions about this. Some drama in the portal class. Brady Hunt he's officially in Columbia now. Walk me through, I guess, that whole process. That all went down since we've last been on the airwaves. So what are you seeing and what are you hearing from the whole Brady Hunt situation?
So here's what I can share, because there's some stuff too that we're still going through the process of, I don't feel good enough yet to be able to go on record saying it as we continue to gather more information. What we do know is this: Brady did indeed decommit from South Carolina. He called the coaching staff earlier in the week. What I can tell you is, and I'm not saying this was the number one reason, but this is something that I put out on Gamecock Central last night, and this is something that people should just keep in mind of. Spencer Rattler's agent, his NIL agent, represents Brady Hunt. His agent has developed a tremendous relationship with USC, the Garnet Trust, the collectives over here. So I know that it rubbed him wrong when all this was going on. And the reason why Brady was looking at going to Texas A&M was simply because a coaching connection, tight ends coach that recruited him at Ball State. So I say that because it looked like it was going to be a done deal. It was pretty much all but a done deal. What's frustrating from talking to coaches and talking with people in the recruiting world, and this isn't directed at Brady, but this is just the reality of it. And we've seen this happen a couple of times with South Carolina. We've seen this happen with a couple schools throughout the country. There's no binding agreement until a player actually enrolls in. Now, there are things such as certain paperwork that is signed that when you do arrive at a school as a transfer, but a lot of it isn't binding still. So that's something in the near future I hope can be fixed, but just to kind of give people as to what happened, again, the relationship that Brady's agent has with the university, as well as when I say the university, I'm talking the coaching staff, I'm talking with the collectives, that helped. And at the end of the day, Brady Hunt's here. So again, there's still some things that we're trying to navigate through to piece everything together. I know I'm trying to remember the exact way he phrased it, so I'm paraphrasing, not putting it exactly in a quote, putting it in stone. But I believe Shane said something to affect the effect of like on Twitter that, Brady Hunt's back. So, I think bottom line is this: he's here. I don't know what that relationship's like right now. I don't know if it's, just the elephants in the room. I think you just say, hey, you know what? Bottom line is he's here. He's here. He's ready to play. And he's someone that can make a big, big, big impact.
Yeah, absolutely. So he is back fully on campus with
Real
the
quick,
team.
real quick. So, buddy,
Obviously, I think it is. Yeah,
Joe. So, buddy said Brady is signed. So he had to wait, though, buddy. You know,
yeah,
he had to wait until the actual enrollment process, until he's
yeah,
actually enrolled in classes. Nothing is in stone. And that's, again, what I was talking about before with the coaches and some of the recruiting coordinators out there across the country. That's one thing that they would like to see changed, because that's why you're seeing players commit out of the transfer portal to a school, but there's no binding agreement. And it's just,
yeah.
to me, that's really silly. Really
I was
silly.
gonna follow up on that too, because like that's the one thing that gets people really confused, because a guy will verbally commit to a place, and until it's very, very set in stone,
It's,
enrolled in school, start going to classes, a guy can flip, right? So I think that's
yeah.
one big thing that gets people tripped up, and it's one thing that needs to change in my mind about this whole cycle. And then the NCAA adding the regulation that guys can transfer it and play
That's
again
the other
that
thing
sort of
too.
fall.
And we
Yeah.
could talk more. This is your show, Joe. I know I've been rambling
Yeah.
about
Hey,
some of
well,
this simply
I mean,
because
we got time.
I've been working on a lot of this stuff over the last
We've
24,
got
48 hours. But that's one thing that is just insane. And it's no shock the NCAA doing what the NCAA does, which is they do stuff stupid. They do stuff dumb. And I know some stuff was, brought to the courts, but the fact that things are changing literally in the middle of the transfer portal, like rules of like, okay, yeah, you can just enter the portal now whenever. When I say whenever, obviously there's windows, unless you're a grad transfer, unless your coach leaves. But when I mean whenever, you can enter the portal your freshman year. You can enter the portal your sophomore year. You can enter the portal your junior year now. And now there's no penalty at all. It's dumb. And I've talked a lot about it on Gamecock Central over the last couple of weeks and some of the stories. So if you are a subscriber, head on over there. You'll be able to find those stories because I had a lot to say about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the message boards, the Insiders Forum is the place to get all of your news. Chris and Wes and Mike are doing a great job during insider season to keep you guys up. But that's the place to do it. The Insiders Forum on Gamecock Central. So, Mike, there was another commitment. Gage Larvadain, Miami of Ohio, top 3 receiver in the MAC last year. What are you seeing from that kid?
Well, he's somebody that, again, was out here on a visit recently. I believe that visit, I'm trying to make sure I don't confuse all my visits because everything's happening all at once here. This was on Thursday night, and there was a long, long list of coaches that were out there with them. And you had a bunch of different players there. You had the defensive back, the in-state defensive back player that transferred into South Carolina. You had Torricelli Simpkins. I mean, you had a bunch of players. So I bring that up because when you look at what South Carolina was able to pick up with Huggins Bruce, again, another local guy, 5'11", 170, not the biggest guy in the world. However, when you look at what South Carolina was trying to do, what they were trying to do as far as going out and trying to get certain players, losing the kid from Vanderbilt didn't help them, right? Another player that committed originally to South Carolina, and then what happens? He flips his commitment a couple of days later via the transfer portal. So I think being able to get a guy with size that's, pretty similar, someone that was very productive, as far as what he was able to do this past season. I'm just looking at something that just popped up here.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Not
Excuse me.
Not this past season. I'm making sure I got my stats right here.
Yeah.
But what he's been able to do as far as being able to build off of some things. Now, again, you look at a school like Louisville, as I mentioned before, we were talking about the Oklahoma commit, Parks. You have players that go into situations where their coaches leave. So I feel like the reason why I say the production, right? And I say the production, when you look at statistically, when you go back and watch the tape of what this young man did over at Louisville, statistically
this
speaking,
from Miami of Ohio.
Yeah,
Larvadain's from Miami of Ohio.
Oh, I'm looking at the Louisville kid right now. We'll hop back over there in a minute, Joe. I'm all over the place with there's been so many
Huggins
welcome
Bruce
homes.
Is a Louisville kid, and we were gonna get to Huggins Bruce anyways. Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna talk about Huggins Bruce. I'm sorry, Joe.
Yeah,
This is what
it's all
happens when
good.
there's like 6 welcome homes in a span of 3 days.
3 days.
So yeah, but with Huggins Bruce, though, again, talking about that he's someone that has played a lot. When you look back to the last couple of years, he's played in 25 games over the last 2 seasons, 7 starts 2 seasons ago. But again, he was in a situation where you had a coaching change. So I bring those things up simply because, there's going to be things where you're not going to be able to control things when you're a player. But going back to the other wide receiver from Miami, Ohio, again, similar built, 5'10", 165. But last season, 10 games, finished with 42 catches, 679 yards and 6 touchdowns. He is someone that has production, is produced.
Yes.
One thing that I can tell you is the coaching staff loves this kid, loves the way he operates, loves how he is wired. They feel like he's a guy that's going to come in here and he's going to work his tail off. He's a guy that was considered a 4-star prospect and the number 8 wide receiver in the portal. So just to give you an idea of how highly these recruiting websites, including us, obviously, and On3. When I say us, I'm not specifically talking about you, Joe, me, Wes, and Chris. I'm talking about the network, the site, how high they are on this young man. So, look, the beauty of it is when you have a lot of these wide receivers coming in here, especially in a wide receiver room that does not have a lot of production returning, you're going to be in a situation where I don't want to say you're throwing darts in the dark here, but in some sense, you're going to try to figure out who is going to work here. And God forbid someone doesn't work here, so be it. And I'm not saying that about these 2 individuals that we just talked about, but the whole point being is you need to find a way to just get some type of production in this room.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris says too late for the Red Bull. It's Arnold Palmer, for those wondering. Still has a little caffeine, but obviously, so we're always working. But yeah, Larva Dane, I think, can make a difference. This wide receiver room, we're seeing what the strategy portal is. Straight up, just get as much speed and competition as possible. And, good things are going to come from that. We saw that last year. You had Juice Wells, Xavier Legette, Eddie Lewis. The list goes on and on about guys that were in that room and competing for the starting job. You came of it. Xavier Legette came out of the rubble, if you will, and had a breakout season. Nick Harbor coming up in the room as well. So good to get a couple of vets to bring up Harbor. Larva Dane and Huggins Bruce have both seen a lot of football, so big to add them. And again, both of them, I believe both of them can return punts. Larva Dane, at his stop before Miami of Ohio, he was at a JUCO and he had a couple punt returns there. But I don't know, we could see him. Any players on the board to play special teams for South Carolina? I will say this, minus the quarterback, but yeah, Mike, two big wide receivers there. So there's 2 more players that they've added since signing day. One of them being the linebacker out of Charlotte, Demetrius Knight. What are you seeing from him?
Well, he's 6'2", 247. And what I've noticed with him, and you look at the wide receivers too that we just talked about, all 3 of those players, 2 wide receivers and Knight, they all have 1 year of eligibility remaining. So what that tells me, and it's not going to be a shocker, right? You're looking at some of the situations that have transpired, whether it be transfer portal, whether it be lack of production in some of these rooms. That tells me that South Carolina is looking for a quick fix. And when you look at the talent they have in some of those rooms, right? You look at the young talent they have at the linebacker room. You look at some of the young players, even sophomores in that wide receiver room, guys that maybe just didn't have the opportunities for one reason or another, or maybe they just weren't there last season to be able to start playing a little bit more. It's allowing you to be able to hopefully have that quick fix, right? To be able, as we've joked around before, Joe, in our show, put the Flex Seal patch on it to fix the boat real quick. And you're able to do what you can just so you're able to get by. So again, here's a guy that can come in here, has experience, was a phenomenal player at Charlotte, first team all conference. I believe he led the team in tackles, had 96 of them. South Carolina losing Stone, losing Pup Howard, being able to bring in a guy like this who, again, and I've said this before, Yes, it's nice to be able to have some of the big name guys as far as big name schools, right? Being able to bring in a guy from Oklahoma, being able to bring in a guy from Alabama. But it's also nice, too, to be able to bring guys in, even if they're from smaller schools, that have done exceptional job where they were. FCS, Group 5, whatever the case may be, he's a young man that was an absolute freak at Charlotte. And being able to go in there, and I'm really, really excited to see what Bam can do.
Yeah.
But you look at, obviously, what Debo Williams did a year ago. Never mind the fact of the young, talented running linebackers coming up through that room. And there's some other talented guys in that room. But you add this guy in there, too? My goodness. And again, 1 year of eligibility, that tells me they're just trying to get that quick fix, which is all right to allow your younger players to be able to get developed behind them.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike, one more player before I get you out of here, if you don't mind. And obviously with Demetrius Knight, it's a case-by-case basis. And linebacker, they need to, like Mike said, patch the Band-Aid. I firmly agree. And linebacker it's one of those positions where, you've got guys coming up, but you do need depth. You need depth in all positions. But Torselli Simpkins, Mike, the last guy that was added since signing day, 6'5", 310, big boy in Simpkins. What are you seeing from him?
I think Wes said it best earlier in the week that you can get so caught up in the fact that he played at the FCS level, but he was an FCS All-American, and he did some really, really good things. And when you look at the offensive line position, as we've talked about before, right, being able to add a player, Parks from Oklahoma, on the offensive line from the portal, you bring in guys here at a position where you were hurting badly last year when it came to depth, when it came to proven depth. And even proven depth can look like some of these guys coming in, like Parks from Oklahoma, where you don't have a lot of experience, but you have experience, as I alluded to before, in practice going up against some really talented players every day. You go to Oklahoma, you go to Alabama, you're going up against some studs every friggin' day. Every day. So I think more than anything, you look at a young man that's coming in here, as I said, worst case scenario, he's providing depth. Best case scenario, he's a guy that can come in here and can compete. What I like about Simpkins, he's played center, he's played some guard, he's played multiple spots in the offensive line. 6'5" guy. We talked about this before with Nick Gargiulo. Poor guy, obviously, he went through a lot of injuries towards the end of the season, had to play musical chairs simply because South Carolina was so beat up. But the beauty with a guy like Simpkins, he can move around. He can be, as we've talked about before, Joe, he can kind of be like your utility guy in the offensive line if you need him to be. I think he's a guy that will certainly get reps at center this spring. They'll certainly rep a couple guys at center. But I think Simpkins is a guy to keep an eye on when you're talking about as a possible starting center heading into next season. He was the MEAC Offensive Lineman of the Year this past year. Charlotte guy, has ties to the Carolinas, played at North Carolina Central this past season. I really like what I've seen with him. And talking with former Gamecock offensive linemen, they love his feet. For a guy that big, they really like his feet. And what I'm interested to know as we get closer to the spring, just his knowledge, being able to have a very knowledgeable center, especially if you're going to have a young quarterback, right? I mean, the two guys that we have in the room right now that you look at, you have, of course, Lenora Sellers, redshirted freshman, and then you have Dante Reno. And we would assume South Carolina at some point, whether it be before spring, whether it be after spring, they're going to go out and they're going to bring in some type of competition, at least in that room. But at least for the time being, especially going through spring right now, you need to be able to have a center that can help these young quarterbacks learn. Someone that can help them be a little patient. So it's going to take Simpkins to be a leader. And, with Gargiulo, he did a tremendous job. Of course, he was the only captain at Yale before he came here. But Simpkins is going to be a guy that has to come in here, and he's going to have to earn that trust right away. Because I feel like if he can do that, he can be extremely valuable to this team, not just from a playing standpoint, but with everything else from a leadership standpoint, just knowing how young your quarterback room is right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike, you're hitting the nail on the head with Simpkins there. And I mean, Carolina should be taking a breath of fresh air with this signing because you finally have more than one real true center on the roster, right? You have kind of a backup guy that can, potentially go get a start. I think the big worry with him is just adjusting to the speed of the SEC and just how big guys are. It's different when guys are that big coming at you that fast. Like football is football at the end of the day. But when guys are that big coming at you a little bit faster, it's a whole another adjustment that you got to make.
Yeah, and buddy, I think you're spot on. I mean, Nick Gargiulo was very underappreciated. I think, and I shared this too once the season was done. I mean, Nick was playing with a busted up hand. How the hell he was able to grip the football to snap it, I have no idea. I have no idea. But because South Carolina's offensive line was so beat up, he pushed through it. He pushed through it. And, was it pretty at times? Certainly not. But because of how deflated the offensive line room was, especially as the year went on, towards the end, beginning certainly, there was no other option really. So look, I think more than anything, we could sit here and say, okay, this is what needs to happen. That what's neat. Obviously, they need to be able to stay healthy at certain positions, right? You look at the talent, you look at the young talent in particular, the experience now that they were able to gain, a guy like Luedecke and Babalade, a guy like Trevon Baugh, what they were able to do this past season, certainly from a glass half full standpoint, you look at it and you're saying, all right, that's great. In the moment, probably not so much. On top of that, too, you have a guy like Marquis Anderson who didn't have an opportunity really to play at all because he got hurt before the year even started. So you got a lot of young talent. You have some returning talent back. I'm interested to see what they do with a guy like Vershawn Lee. He's someone that has experience playing center. I think he'll get some reps at center. But if I had to take an early guess, and I was wrong last year, I said Gargiulo would be the center. He eventually became the center. But the reason why he didn't start at center is because they felt like there was a need for him to play other positions because it helped the offensive line as a whole. And then obviously they did musical chairs, Joe. But I think that when you look at Torselli Simpkins, I think he will be the guy to keep an eye on to be an early favorite to be starting center for South Carolina this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, again, a very big addition. And so my plenty of, evolving, things happen in the transfer portal for South Carolina. You're keeping us updated with all of it. You, Chris and Wes, are doing a great job. Appreciate you taking the time to hop on my show as busy as you are. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. This was a really good night. I appreciate everyone for tuning in with this thing live. We're going to keep it that way for the near future. So, yeah, excited to be back. And
Tuesday.
Everyone tuning in. Yeah.
Tuesday, 2:00. Intern Joe and I will be on. We're going to be moving up Talking Tuesdays to 2:00.
Yep.
In the off season. We'll see how that goes because we know there's basketball games going on. We know baseball's right around the corner as well. We're going to slide them up to 2:00. And if you can't catch the show, no worries. We replay it on the Gamecock Central YouTube page, where you can watch it for free in its entirety. In addition to that, if you're a podcast listener, we'll have all these shows on there as well. But a lot of great stuff coming up with the movement going on with the coaching changes and whatnot. And I say coaching changes, of course, the running back position could be another one coming down the pipeline very soon. We'll continue to monitor that as well. But that's kind of where we stand. But Gamecock Central will keep you locked in. That's why, again, I apologize for looking down the phone throughout the show because we're trying to continue to follow certain things that we feel like could happen in the near future. So be sure to head on over to Gamecock Central. We'll keep you guys posted.
Yeah, absolutely. The Insiders Forum is the best. And Mike, Chris, Wes are our favorite insiders. They're doing the best job. And then also, I will say, tune in to The Hard Foul. It is back this week. Me and Jack Veltri, our weekly basketball show, will be back 6 p.m. Or I think we're going at 7 p.m. on Wednesday night, the Hoop Show. I think we'll break down men's and women's, and we got a couple good guests for that show coming up here soon too. So thank you guys for tuning in again tonight. I'm Intern Joe. As always, have a good week.